The relationship between delta G, delta H, and delta S is an important one, for it is difference of the two terms on the right side that determine the sign of the one on the left, that determine the sign of delta G. And it is the sign of delta G, whether it's positive or negative, which gives us an indication of whether the reaction will occur naturally, that is spontaneously, or it will not occur naturally, that is to say, it's non-spontaneous. To understand this, let's first explain this graphically and then we'll look at it mathematically. Let's assume the reactants have a total energy content of 10 kilojoules, and they react and give rise to products, and the overall energy of the products is, say, 15 kilojoules. The change in energy, the change in total energy, is the final state minus the initial state, in this case 5 kilojoules. It is this plus sign that's important. On the other hand, let's suppose the reactants went to produce products that only had an energy value of 5 kilojoules. In this case, the energy change is represented by the final state minus the initial state, which equals minus 5. It is this positive sign which tells us that the reaction was, if you will, uphill. That energy was gained in that reaction. And using water as an analogy, water does not naturally run uphill, and neither do reactions. And so this uphill reaction, if you will, would be said to be non-spontaneous, or not occurring naturally. On the other hand, the other reaction had a negative sign, indicating that the energy change was downhill. Just as water runs naturally downhill, so do reactions. And so a downhill reaction is said to be spontaneous. Now let's look at this phenomena in terms of the mathematics of our equation. Let's now look at 4 mathematical possibilities where delta H is minus and delta S is positive, delta H is positive and delta S is minus, or both are positive or both are negative. In the first case, if delta H is minus and delta S is positive, anytime one has a negative number and you subtract from it another number, the answer must necessarily be negative. What this means is, anytime delta H is negative and delta S is positive, the reaction must be spontaneous. On the other hand, if delta H is plus and delta S is minus, this is a little bit trickier, because what we have here is a negative sign in front of a negative number. And if you remember the little mathematical trick for that, anytime you have two negative numbers multiplied by each other, you can just change both of those to plus signs. So what you really have in this scenario right here, that's really tantamount to saying a positive number plus a positive number. And so necessarily you're going to get a positive number. If delta G is a positive number, it's uphill, and therefore we know that it necessarily is going to be non-spontaneous. Let's now look at the third scenario, in which delta H is plus and delta S is plus. This relationship too takes a little care to understand. If delta H is plus and you subtract another number from it, the difference between the two will be positive if delta H is larger, and it will be negative if delta S is larger. And so in this case, we don't really know what it's going to be. It just depends on which is larger. And the same is true for the last scenario. Again, consider our little math trick. And what you have is a negative number with a positive number added to it, essentially. In this case, if delta H is larger, then delta G is going to be negative. But if delta S is larger, then delta G is going to be positive. So again, we do not know. It just depends on which one is larger. And that's your 4 scenarios. A loss of energy means downhill reaction, so it's spontaneous. A gain of energy means energy changes uphill. It is necessarily non-spontaneous. In the case where both delta H and delta S are positive or negative, we don't know whether the difference between those two is going to be positive or negative. So we have to work the equation out and see if we get a negative number or a positive number. And that's your 4 possible scenarios.